Welcome back to the fourth and the last session of today's conference on human and economic security. Please welcome Ms. Hitomi Kobu, Resource Mobilization Officer, Human Security Unit, United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security, who will moderate this session. Welcome, ma'am. Our keynote presentation will be made by Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General, RIS. For this session, we have a panel of distinguished experts and practitioners amongst us, which include Dr. Joseph Siracusa, Professor of Human Security and International Diplomacy, School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, RMIT University, Australia. We also have with us Dr. P.K. Anand, Visiting Fellow, RIS, and Mr. Krishna Kumar, Visiting Fellow, RIS. We will follow the same format in respect to time as the previous session, which is also mentioned in the handbook. I now request the moderator to kindly commence the session.
Thank you very much. So we have made it to the last panel of the day. And I think building off of what has been a very rich set of discussions on non-traditional economic and security risks. So for this panel, we're looking at human and economic security, leveraging the SDGs for economic development and social stability. As I think many of you know, when human security was sort of first introduced formally, so not necessarily the origins of the concept, but when it was first introduced formally into the global lexicon in the early 90s, it really was representing a very fundamental shift in how we view stability, security, and social and economic progress. And obviously, since that time, we've had massive changes, life and landscape altering changes in terms of technology, commerce, communications, and that has brought us, as I think we spoke a lot about in all of the preceding panels, to a number of new opportunities and a number of new and complex challenges. And so it's not surprising that in this landscape, the concept of human security has again sort of reasserted itself and become something both in the academic community, but also in the international community, in the context of the UN, that has once again become sort of an important objective, but also an important framework to help us reach that objective. So we are very fortunate today to have some leading thinkers on this question here on the panel, and they are going to help us answer sort of three primary questions. What are some of the most pressing challenges to human and economic security today? How can we leverage now this new roadmap we have, the SDGs, to counteract these risks and threats? And what types of actions, policy or otherwise, can we take to actually ensure human and economic security for all? So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Chaturvedi.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ms. Kubo, for your very interesting and useful remarks in the beginning for setting the tone of our panel. It also helps in terms of contextualizing the idea of sustainable development goals in the backdrop of the issues that you just mentioned, particularly of human and economic security. Since we are already running late, I would focus on 5 different areas that I think are important as we are going ahead with our idea of leveraging SDGs for addressing the human and economic security related issues. First and foremost, that I think the panel today that we heard in terms of environment and energy security, where we talked about the impact of climate change. And I think impact of climate change and its imperatives across various goals of the SDG, I think is extremely important. Just a few days back when we were in Uganda, the president of Uganda raised a very important and interesting point in terms of carbon emission from farms, and the meeting was organized by FAO. And he was saying that we never knew rice. I don't know why my country is growing rice, and I'm told that the carbon footprint of this crop is huge. So the point that he was trying to make was that the crops that they were growing, they never used chemical fertilizers, and the carbon footprint of their cultural traditional practices was minimal. It is the development process that has derailed their local culture, their local demand pattern, their local ability to indigenize the development pattern. It is the global agencies that have contributed, and now he was saying that I am time and again told of carbon footprint of agriculture. So he was saying that, and he's very funny. Those of you who know President Museveni, he's very funny. So he would say that I did not know NKP, NPK. So he was trying to play around with the words, and he was saying that why don't you serve all these delegates in the room bananas, because once I visited Washington, I was told of something in the morning. I said, what is this? And they told me something like banana. And I could not believe it, because in Uganda we do not have this big banana. We have very small and very sweet bananas. So he was trying to make a point in a very funny manner, but I thought was communicating a very serious point in terms of how the whole agriculture production pattern in Uganda has changed in a major way. He also raised his concerns about swamp and marshy land. As you know, Lake Victoria and area around that has a swampy area where they are growing swampy rice. So he was saying that this is not something that we have eaten, why it is being served to us. And that's where I think this whole point of desertification that was raised this morning, in terms of we losing out something like a 63,000 square meter in 2019 alone. So that loss that we have gone through is something which is extremely important for us to take note of. The fact that agriculture practices, agriculture pattern, which are important for SDG goal 2, and as we know, these goals are cross-connected with several other goals. So it is not just goal 2, but also goal 7, where the energy dimension comes in. So for me, first and foremost is agriculture, and the losses that we are facing in agriculture, I think are extremely important. If we look at in 2019 alone, we had something like 764,000 deaths, largely because of the diseases and patterns emanating out of that. And that's my second point in terms of health security. So after agriculture, the second point that I see as a major challenge for human and economic security is related to the health sector. And that's where we would have to be extremely concerned in terms of how it is accessible to people below poverty lines, those who have been excluded, but also to adolescent and under age 5 children. The statistics that we have before us is alarming. The maternal mortality rate and child mortality rate, both are extremely dangerous in terms of how the numbers are coming up, both in sub-Saharan Africa but also in many parts of Asia. The statistics that I have before me suggest that in 2018 alone, an estimated 6.2 million children and young adolescent girls under age of 15, they died mostly from preventable causes. So when we have such big challenges, SDG 3, which is about health, is extremely important in terms of this challenge that we are talking of. The third, and I think much more important when we talk about SDGs, is the difference that we want to draw from MDGs. It is not just continuation of MDG, and that's where I'm always afraid, and with my colleagues I always keep on discussing how to prevent SDGs from their MDGization. And that, I think, is different, and we should understand that SDG is not about numbers, it is about quality. So how we bring this narrative back to development where it's not quantity but quality, and that quality runs across all the goals, whether you talk about goal 2 for agriculture, goal 3 for health, goal 4 for education, goal 5 for gender, goal 6 for water, goal 7 for energy. You talk of all these goals, and what MDG did was a quantitative estimation and putting a sort of focus on that. But SDGs have given us the bandwidth, the gravitas that is required to achieve quality. So how we move towards that, and this again goes back to my next point, which is about the idea of our development, the development narrative per se. So the Washington consensus, we say, is dead, and we are moving towards more of a third way for development, which is combining both the elements, but of capitalist and socialist. But important part is, if that development narrative is at the center, what is it that SDG is bringing in? And to me, SDG then brings in the idea of quality, which is extremely important and crucial for us to move forward. And the idea may also vary in terms of how we are looking at the question of financial inclusion. We are bringing in banks, the point that I was mentioning this morning, in terms of exclusions that are happening because people do not have access to finance, they do not have access to quality finance, and things like that, because then that gets determined by several multilateral institutions and institutions which are in grave danger, as we discussed across the 3 sessions this morning, including the one on migration, the whole crisis of multilateralism. So the point is over-encompassing the larger idea of our development narrative, and that I think requires an alternative approach. And this is where, for some of us in the South, as we call it, the developing world, is very different from the Anglo-Saxon approach that has been there on development. And I'm sorry that that I'm trying to bring in the regional specificity, but I think it is important that the global institutions, which have been prescribing the development narrative, would have to change their alternative. Unfortunately, the emerging powers, the countries whose economy share is rising, are not getting adequate space in terms of setting the development agenda for the global institutions. And that's my last point, as to if SDGs have to succeed, they have to succeed in the developing part of the world. There is larger global South, I don't deny that. There are exclusions happening even in United States, exclusions happening in other parts of the world. So we would have to give space to those who have been excluded from the process. And if SDGs have to succeed, they have to bring in the human and economic security and the wherewithals that are required from that perspective. And that also brings in the space that is needed by the environment and the ecology-related institutions. The whole institutions that are led by several civil society organizations should also not be undermined. And I think they play an extremely important role in articulating the areas where ecological movements have largely been sidelined in the process. It is not just about growing organic or things like that. It is much larger as to how resource intensification has happened, and we have not handled the idea of managing local ecology, and that I think is also extremely important in terms of enabling the smallest administrative unit, because excessive centralization has also affected the process of development. And I think at RIS what we have initiated here is the whole exercise on localization of SDGs. So that, I think, is another important dimension. At this stage with my research team, we are working on India's northeast So we have around 8 states where huge challenges for development are there, and we are trying to see how localization of SDGs can bring in. So the extremely centralized approach to development, central prescription by the global financial agencies and institutions, we would have to go back to the idea of local management and have to have faith in local wisdom and local decision making. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very rich presentation. I think there is an incredible amount that we can unpack when we get to the discussion section, particularly in how maybe the human security and SDG framework really can, if we look at them holistically, can provide that space and that very sort of ground-up perspective that you're talking about. So now I will turn it over to Professor Siracusa for your 5-ish minutes.
Okay. We need some pictures, so some French philosopher says we weren't here. It's very important. Okay. Now, first of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here. And as Ronald Reagan used to say at my age, it's a pleasure to be anywhere. Now, I've written a lot of books, and one of them was about globalization and human security. I wrote it with a friend of mine in Melbourne who knew a great deal about globalization, but not much about human security, and I'd been following the human security, so I joined him in the book. And today I'd like to critique what I did 10 years ago. When I do the new edition, I'm going to add these comments to it. What I want to do is I want to refine the concept of human security so that we use it properly in the future. Now, I'm going to read some of these comments to build them into the record so that we have some flesh when people go to write what happened here. Now, the adjective human in human security has, I think, been taken for granted. Certainly, the concept has evoked much discussion and debate over how it should be defined. However, despite this direct attention, it has become rare for the obvious semantic core of the concept to be examined. To do so is to begin to interrogate the meaning of the phrase, the human. In my comments, rather than getting buried in debates over the narrow version of security, I want to take a couple steps into this task by treating security and risk as part of the contingent and negotiated condition of human living. Human security needs to be understood as a variable condition of the human, what the 1994 report called the universalism of life, or human life for itself. In other words, if this thing called human security has the concept of the human embedded at the heart of it, then let's address the question of the human condition. Thus understood, human security would no longer be the vague, amorphous add-on to harder-edged areas of security, such as military security or state security. Neither would it be reduced to a few complementary factors such as food security, water security, economic security, and personal security, linked by the notion freedom from want. Human security approaches in the past 10 years, I think, have been damned because the concept lacks a precise and generally agreed definition. It has become a contested phrase along with globalization and human rights and the rest of it. Now, despite the path-breaking work done on the concept, proponents of human security remain imprisoned by existing dominant discourses. Instead of taking the concept of human as relating to the human condition and treating state security as being encompassed by human security, they tend to treat human security and military security as separate but equal domains. This seems positive in the context of contemporary international relations. Over the last few decades, the importance of state security or military security had been lifted into the common sense prominence that the more recent concern with human security has struggled to find even a place. For example, the report Human Security Now suggests that human security complements state security, enhances human rights, and strengthens human development. Or again, quote, human security and state security are mutually reinforcing and dependent on each other, close quote. Right quickly, these statements make sense. But in each of them, state security has somehow been lifted to the same level as the other much broader considerations of human development and human rights. It is as if state-based security and the military apparatus has a separate life from the human. Human is subsequently brought back to the complementary relationship in human-wide categories such as rights, development, and security. It is easy to see why this is the case given the extraordinary emphasis in the last decade to the global war on terror, and my favorite, Homeland Security, both often used with capital letters in case you missed the point. Human security has come to be defined by all those security areas that are not encompassed directly by the state or human security. My proposition is human security is what is left after the war machine has been given full standing. There is a simple, massive, and overriding point that is missed in all of this. The human as a category encompasses by definition considerations of governance, the state, and the military, and all the domains of social life beyond. Therefore, human security should include and subsume state and military security rather than sit alongside those other considerations. The fact that it is not has major implications how we respond to disasters. Disasters, including the slow disaster of climate change, are no less consequential in prospect and outcome than military threats. They are no less broad and therefore in the category of how we understand these things. Currently, this is not even close to being the case. If taken seriously, this rethink would have significant consequences for convention and application. It would mean, in conclusion, that threat assessment and resourcing of preparation for disasters, as well as responding after disasters, will become as important as preparing and going to war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In a way, I have to say this is an argument perhaps that the Human Security Unit at the UN has actually been trying to make as well. So I look forward
I didn't
to.
steal anything from you.
But so I look forward to hearing a little bit more about then how we actually shift the institutions in order to realize that reality. But before that, we now will turn it over to Dr. Anand for his remarks.
Thank you very much. We have talked about security, human security. I think opportunities matter a lot when it comes to it. So one strand of economics is that, okay, we try to help people who are vulnerable, who need something. But another strand is that we make them competent enough that they can earn themselves. On many occasions, Sachin has spoken on these lines that from entitled waste, instead of giving some entitlement to a poor person, we make it entrepreneurship based. Now, when we talk of SDGs in totality reflect human values, ethos, and norms. If I pick up just one SDG, say SDG 2 on nutrition, we were doing an analysis I was doing with Mr. Krishna Kumar, and we realized that when we see it across the countries, the conditional probability of finding a country doing well on SDG 2 is quite linked to all other SDGs also. But it's the topmost relationship comes with water and sanitation. So where will what be needed to move forward and move ahead, that matters a lot. There has been some discussion on, say, poverty also. The non-traditional thinking today is that we move to multidimensional poverty. I was analyzing the definition given by the UN, and I thought that it needs some additions. It does talk of, say, nutrition and mortality, but I feel anemia, especially of pregnant women, micronutrients are very important. And in India, we have started a scheme, Ayushman Bharat, in which we have already covered more than 6 million people. Then on education and skills today, it's not that we see that people need something, some help. Rather, they should be imparted skills. In my opinion, imparting skills is an essential part to see that a person doesn't suffer from insecurity later on in his life. So that's a very important strand besides quality of education. In fact, when we talk of quality of education also, we overlook, we just see at number of years of schooling. but we overlook the kind of education, the quality of education, and is the student being tuned to move towards, say, computer literacy or towards, say, science, technology, etc. He can imbibe during his career. So these things are also equally important. I'll next point out on one non-traditional manner in which our PM had taken a step on Give It Up campaign on liquefied petroleum gas. And against 10 million households which came forward and gave up the subsidy, though they were retaining the connections, 80 million have already been given in India. And it cuts across many SDGs, SDG 5, SDG 10, SDG 3, you name it, and it cuts across it. Drinking water and sanitation, a massive performance has been done in India. We have already covered 1.07 million toilets have been given. On electricity, which is a necessity today, not even one village in India is now unelectrified. On housing, 17.8 million houses have been given. So, similarly, on safety nets, more than 168 million people have been covered. My last point will be on inequality. I feel that when we talk of human security, the choice of indicator for measuring inequality is very critical. Our indicator itself should not be a very poor choice of indicator. So we do see that the mundane way is that we go by head count ratio or poverty gap. But what I feel that there are better indicators like Thiel index. It captures, it gives a higher weightage because SDG 10.1 target says the last 4 deciles, their income growth should be more than that of the rest of the economy. That means the median of the last 4 deciles should exceed the median of the topmost 6 deciles. So that becomes very critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anand. I think you hit on two really core principles that are embedded both in human security and the SDGs that we can look into a little bit more, one being, for lack of a better term, this notion of empowerment, and also the idea of leaving no one behind, which really is one of the central promises of the SDGs, and how can we effectively do that, but also more effectively measure that. So for our last speaker, I will give it over to Mr. Kumar.
Thank you very much. The tone of this session has already been set by Madam Hitome and Professor Sachin. Some points have been made, and I will take up the part of the data issue on here. What is the role of the data in the human security and whatever the economic security or the social security in any kind of things. See, today we are moving. Now we are heading for the Industrial 4 revolution, and we are also heading for Society 5. SDG is all about, if successful implementation is done for this SDGs, we will certainly achieve moving towards I4 and Society 5. And here the data plays an important role. This is not because only that it gives you some idea about the policy making or finding out the shortcomings in the policy implementation, but it also brings the transparency and accountability in the implementation. So data is playing a crucial role in the successful implementation of the SDGs, but the problem here, the Asia and Pacific countries, if we look at the UNESCAPE report released this year sometime in May or June, based on 2018 data, they clearly warn, they have categorically said in that report that no, we are not going to achieve the SDGs by 2030. That is really a very categorical statement and very alarming, and we have to be careful and make our efforts in a more accelerated way to achieve the SDGs. Some progress have been made towards SDG 1, SDG 4, SDG 7, but these progress are not sufficient to achieve, zero poverty or the quality education or the energy security at the end of 2030. All other goals, they are stagnating or going in a reverse way. So this is a very alarming situation. Now, how the data can improve the position? See, today, Asia Pacific region is producing only 83 indicators out of 244 of the global indicator, about 36%. No data is available for other. So whatever the picture has been presented, this is based on the availability of the data. If countries are able to produce more quality data, timely data, and collect, process in a scientific way, certainly some better position may emerge on some of the fronts. The data today does not tell, we don't have the disaggregated, because the principle is no one left behind. In statistics, it means disaggregated data, clearly. If you don't have the disaggregated data, you cannot find out who is left behind. So data plays an important role, and the South Asian countries, South Asia or Southwest Asia countries are lacking in its capacity, not in data. Availability of data is there. We are in the era of IoT, Internet of Things. A lot of data is being generated. Information is generated, but the problem is how to process this data and how to disseminate this data for our welfare purposes. That capacity is lacking in Asia and Pacific. And here, one more point, that our progress on SDG 17, which is key for achieving the SDGs, is going in a reverse direction. I think this we will come during the course of discussion, because there is no time, I cannot elaborate on those, but some non-traditional methods are available. Something is available to overcome these problems within the available resources of each country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar. I think that's absolutely a very important point for us to discuss more, is because I don't know the exact saying, but what we measure is what we do, something along those lines. And so if we're not able to measure it effectively, we really can't be on that path. So I want to thank Professor Kasru for giving us a little bit of freedom to manage this discussion session a little bit differently. I will ask a few questions, or one question, I think, of each of the panelists. I've also asked the panelists to ask questions of each other. And we want to start right away with it being open from the floor. So if you have a question, please don't hesitate to put your hand up, and we can handle this very interactively. But I guess as the moderator, I get to start with just a couple questions. So I'll start with Professor Chaturvedi. You discussed the need for really an alternative approach that's sort of driven by the reality of southern countries, as you said, and the need for greater localization. We saw this with the introduction of human security itself, and I'm going to actually ask a similar question to Professor Siracusa. We saw a conceptual shift that was very important, but we didn't necessarily see the institutional or processes change to reflect that shift in practice? And then 9/11 happened, and it really went the other way. So what types of institutional changes, what types of processes do we need to put in place to actually realize, in your case, Professor Chaturvedi, a more localized approach to the SDGs?
Thanks, Madam Moderator. I think one dimension that SDGs bring on table, and today we did not have much time to discuss, is emanating out of Goal 16. The conflicts and peace that you require. And I'm sure in the next section with the presence of Mr. Haldar, the point would come up in a major way as to how we are looking at this whole question of paradigm shift that is needed in terms of conflict affected areas, areas where peace is affected, and at this stage there are conflicts that are going on in not only in South Asian region but across many countries, and this is largely happening because of extremely centralized system of decision making, extremely centralized process of measurement, common parameters, and that's where our fight is in terms of unlearning some of the lessons that we learned in the decades of 60s and 70s. And I think there was a time when the idea of GDP was largely addressed by Amartya Sen and others, and Mahbubul Haq, when they tried to have the idea of human development project. At my institute at RIS, Professor T.C. James and Dr. Sabyasachi Saha and team, they are working on the idea of how we can bring in the idea of wellness index. And this wellness index was suggested to BRICS. I think we need to deepen those ideas where sync with the local is extremely important. So at the global level, institutional change requires change of psyche. It requires change of mindset. It requires change of approaches. I give you another example with which we are grappling at this stage is the idea of Basel norms. And if you look at the global banking sector, you set norms for countries and economies where even access to banks, the brick and mortar branches is not there. The business correspondents are not there. The governments are trying to do to avoid leakages, because corruption is another major issue. So how do you minimize leakages and you bring in the direct benefit transfer to people, but you are not able to reach out through banks to them? So what do you do? And here you have Basel norms which are putting everything under squeeze. So for last 3 years, since I am on the central bank board, we are struggling with this whole notion which was evolved in Basel norm of the idea of the NPA. So what should be an NPA, how that should be defined, what kind of credit extension norms you need to follow. So n number of generalizations which lose out on specificities. And that's where you require change in approach of the global institutions, how they work, whether they can bring in different measurements, whether they can bring in different parameters, whether they can bring in the fact that what Mr. Krishna Kumar very rightly mentioned, a plethora of goals are those where tier 3 indicators has the largest list, because countries are not agreeing. The popular uprisings, the popular conflicts that are there, they are foreclosing options for the governments to come up and freeze and go to public. They can't. If it's a democracy, the risings are far more vocal. What we are seeing in Hong Kong is something that one won't have imagined, but it's happening in front of our eyes. It's happening in Africa, it's happening in several countries. So if we have to make the process inclusive, if we have to contend with the human security along with a peace and the goals that cherish that dimension, particularly goal 16, I would very much suggest change of mindset.
Thank you. Professor Siracusa, I'm going to ask you a bit of a similar question, because I think you touched on the point that so human security kind of gave us three questions, right? The for who, from what, and those we might have agreed on, maybe they got delineated later, but the by what means, it seems like we didn't really take any action on. If we really want to achieve human security, what are the institutional changes that are necessary? And here I'm asking the academic to get really precise about some really concrete recommendations on the types of institutional change that would be necessary to actually sort of realize the human part of human security again.
Well, when I argued for including these concepts into human security, what this requires is governments pushed by their own people to make these issues as though on a war footing. I always thought that the Millennial Goals made a mistake by defining human security as opposed to nuclear security. I think that was a mistake because nuclear security infected all 7 realms. I mean, you can't have any of these things, including the 17 now, unless you have nuclear security and security from weapons of mass destruction. And we are now in the world. We are moving apace on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and I regard cyber as the next weapon of disturbance. In fact, in my series in New York, I call it weapons of mass destruction and disturbance, because cybersecurity has the same way of closing down the grid or shutting off all the toilets somewhere or creating havoc and sickness and all kinds of things. So I think we have to get kind of serious about it. Now, if you solve all these problems and you haven't solved the nuclear, the chemical, the biological, keep in mind that between 1940 and 1991, or 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas Day, the second highest expenditure in American life was nuclear weapons, nuclear research, and nuclear platforms, according to the Brookings audit, atomic audit. The second highest expenditure in American life after Social Security, which was the safety net put up by the Great Depression, or by Franklin Roosevelt. And at that same time, a lot of America's infrastructure was collapsing. You had decay everywhere. I mean, we're spending our money in the wrong places, and I think we're kind of fooling ourselves. Look, I know we can't end these things, but we have to educate people all around the world how to slow it down. And what I like about nuclear diplomacy is we got to buy some time until nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons become anachronisms. We have to find some way to replace them or to stop them. And I think it's not beyond our intelligence to do these kinds of things. But I think we have to get governments. Now, we all come from different places, and we see governments that are completely indifferent to these problems. But unless the governments are pushed by their own people to put these things on a war footing, I think that's where institutions come in. And universities have to engage. Think tanks have to engage. Civil society has to engage. But people, they're trying to just survive in some cases. But I think we have to force governments to have serious ministers or cabinet posts to deal with these things as though on a war footing. Because I tell you, I think in this dangerous and uncertain world we live in, I think we're rolling the dice. I don't think anybody knows how this is going to end, and it's going to end badly. Now, I do not like this phrase existential. I heard Hillary Clinton use it once, existential threat from Iran. And I know a lot of people use it in the UN, existential. Look, the only thing existential that ever happened was the dinosaurs disappeared, and we didn't get a chance to debrief them. So what we're looking at is the end of the game, It's not like we come back from this game. So I think we should drop it's just about how this game ends. And what bothers me is that in the years ahead, as people realize that we cannot solve some of these problems, I think there's going to be a lot of empowered people who head for the hills, and everybody else is going to be swimming somewhere else. I mean, I have a hunch that a lot of people are going to be left behind. Now, I've heard that all my life about don't leave Marines behind, don't leave this behind, or that behind. But when you get down to the crunch, people are going to have trouble just saving the people around them, as a matter of fact. I heard a line in a movie on Air India. I was watching some movie about the end of the world, and some guy says, the day's going to come when someone's going to kill you for a can of peaches. And I thought about that for a while, and I think he's right. Though in my case, it wouldn't be peaches, it'd be plums or something like that. Thank you very much.
If I may just follow up a little bit, just to be a little bit provocative, one of the criticisms of human security all along has been that it's so broad that it's not operational, right? We don't know what to do with it. It encompasses everything. Now we have the SDGs, which has made it a little bit easier now for human security because governments have accepted that no, indeed, we can handle this kind of comprehensiveness and this complexity. But you're sort of arguing to actually pull it out even further.
Yes.
And so how would you respond to that potential criticism that doing so just becomes really challenging operationally and could end up still reprioritizing money in the area of hard security?
Well, the nations that want to oppose this kind of thinking continue to spend endless amounts of money on weapons and preparing for war and that kind of thing. I mean, we got to get out of that mindset. You know, beating up your neighbor is okay, and sometimes it gives you a little satisfaction. But you got to stop sooner or later because you're going to have the same problem at the end of the day. I think people have to force their governments, because governments, and the ones I study, Australia, the United States, and Britain, and some other places, there's no pressure on them. They're just continuing as usual. And I got a sinking feeling about the human condition, and that is, I think some people just are prepared to roll the dice, just pretend it's not happening. And when you put it off so long, and when the house starts to fall or the waters start to rise, they're going to say, oh, well, there's not much we can do about it anyway. You can. And what I love about that Greta kid is she just reminds everybody about what is obvious. She's not a prophet. She's not looking, at tea leaves. She's just saying, we're screwed unless you do something. And I loved it when she said that. And she talked to people who looked at her blankly and thought she was off her medication or something like that. If she'd have been a 16-year-old boy playing soccer, there'd have been adulation plus millions of dollars on payday. But because she was this kid who said that something's terribly wrong. Well, actually, something is terribly wrong. And I think we have not listened to our inner conscience for the past 10 or 15 years. I just think it's easier to ignore it than to do something about it. But I think that the human security concept, I think it works because it's something we can put our head around. It puts words to ideas. Maybe it's not perfect, but what is? And I thought when they came up with the idea, it was a terrific idea. I didn't think it was inclusive enough because it didn't subsume the hard stuff. But I think it's a great start, and I was reading on the plane, some great scholar says there are 4 things that are similar between the millennium and this one, and there are all kinds of scholarly comment. But the point is, we ain't got no other plan. This is it. If we're going to get out of poverty and death and destruction, it's not like we got 6 plans to choose from. This is it. And so we either sign aboard or we sign off.
Thank you. Well, I think you're sort of hitting on the power to the people.
Yeah.
So that also links very nicely with what Dr. Anand was talking about in terms of really empowerment and capacity building of people so that we can successfully leave no one behind. And you were mentioning a couple examples around programs in India on micronutrients and women and anemia. Could you share some more examples of how concretely you are doing this capacity building or programming or policies that are happening in India that are really reaching those who are furthest behind?
I'll start with the poorest of the poor in India, and they are covered under a scheme which is an act of the parliament also, right to get unskilled work for 100 days a year. Now, in the earlier years, they were coming and working on, for say, public assets. Later on, it was realized that the program is not primarily to give wages. It should create productive assets. And on top of it, it should actually create public assets in the sense that now geotagging has been done of whatever assets are being done. I recall my days when I was in Ministry of Rural Development, I was handling rural roads. And my friend and colleague and batchmate was handling this program. So one day I was sitting with him and he was feeling that sometimes a news comes that this asset has not been created. So I told him, I said, if you want, you can start it from today. I'll give you a solution which will work from today itself. But if you ask me to give a solution which will start working after a month, that will fail. So I was holding charge of the Chief Vigilance Officer of the ministry also. So I issued him an order to my batchmate that at 3 stages of the program, photographs should be taken. At inception, so that we see whatever the before situation, during, so that laborers are seen, and afterwards, and upload it. And I said, now you can't go to the minister because it is a direction from the CVO, and you have to follow it. And he followed, and from the next day it started. So idea is that when we are talking of capacity building, once we know that if money is flowing out of the exchequer, asset is actually going to be built. Second issue comes, what kind of assets? If these are water conservation assets, now that has been allowed even on the fields of the farmers who are coming for work. They can now work with the help of the neighbors, so that kind of, eventually they have now a higher probability of irrigation on their fields. And because the irrigated area as a proportion of the total net sown area is rising, so they are sure that they have the assets which are giving them a far better payback, and the likelihood of falling back into the trap of poverty falls down. So that's one way. Secondly, there is a strand of programs on skill development in a big way. That's being emphasized. A new ministry has been created for that, just for that purpose. And they are imparting. And then I would like to add one last point, that we have, for a policy, we have a think tank from government, Niti Aayog. So what they have done, there is a program on innovation, Atal Innovation Mission. So they have started tinkering labs. So initial target was just to go for 500 schools and we just do something, because the traditional way will not function. So we should have a tinkering lab which is modern. And students are captivated that yes, I can really learn something which will build my skill, my capacity. From 500, they jumped straight away to 10,000 tinkering labs. So these are the interventions which are going to build capacity definitely. Idea is that it's not that we bring out people from poverty. Idea is that people don't fall into poverty. So technology is also helping. If I know that somebody's gene is indicating a higher probability that person may have cancer during long-term life, it's better to attack those that kind of problem in the beginning itself, and through better allocative efficiency, we segregate and we prescribe medicines, etc., right from the beginning, or lifestyles. So that can help a lot in this direction, and at a reasonable price, which can be afforded by a country which is not very rich in resources.
Thank you. At this year's high-level political forum, actually, one of the main comments was that we're not focusing enough on the question of localization, and it seems that it would be good to have some exchange of practices and policies across governments that are more successfully leading to these localized and disaggregated sort of strategies. And so that brings us to my last question for you, because it looks like we're going to wrap up our session a little bit early. And maybe we'll wrap it up on a positive note. You mentioned, you spoke a lot about data and disaggregation, and I was curious, when we look at the SDGs, obviously we're looking at a really broad set of data. So there must be some areas where we are doing well in terms of having good disaggregated data. So where are some of the areas that we're doing well in terms of that, and where are some of the areas where maybe more focus and attention needs to go into so that we can be effectively measuring what we hope to achieve?
Thank you. Now, today, what the statistical system does, they work in an environment of the whatever the act or the policy governing the statistics. The policy, in accordance with that, the disaggregated data is produced by the NSO. If the policy itself, for example, some countries may not like to release the data on the releaser. It is prohibited in their law. They will not release the data on release. You don't have the data on release on them. Though they may be compiling. Some countries may not be producing the data on the gender for various reasons. So every country, National Statistical Office of every country operates within the policy and legislative framework for these statistics, given for these statistics. In India, the Statistics Office, it is rated as one of the best among the Asia Pacific statistics. Official statistics produced by the Indian official statistical system has been rated by the World Bank, IMF. IMF has given the ranking 4.8 at the scale of 0.05. World Bank has ranked the statistical capacity of the NSO India at 77.8 at the scale of 0 to 100. So it is one of the best, but still our statistical capacity is very low to produce the data, disaggregated data, even at the geographical unit. So localization of data is required. Government of India has started a program, Digital Initiative. Part of one is BharatNet. It is known as the BharatNet. What is the BharatNet doing? The local data, all the villages at the village level, every village will be connected by the high-speed internet broadband connection. Work in progress, about more than 65 or 68% work has already been done, and something is to be completed, targeted to be completed by 2022, when we will be celebrating our 75th year of independence. So by that time, we expect that our Digital India connectivity will be provided all across all the villages. So, and we have set up, community centers at the village level. Those village level, the functionaries at the, because it is a three-tier type administration. This is Panchayati Raj, this is local level, then state level, then central level. This is a whole of the democratic process. I cannot explain all those things, but the local level functionaries, they will enter all kind of data. Either it is related to the agriculture, or it is related to the soil health, it is related to the, death, birth, whatsoever is. Every data will be entered there, and they will flow from there. So that way the data will come, the local data will be available, disaggregated data will be available, and we are also, the government of India has also given due importance to the transformative technologies. The economic survey, which is a basic document, just come before, one day before the presentation of the union budget. This is a very, important document so far as the government is concerned. Economic survey of this year is one chapter, for the first time, is totally devoted on the data. And the importance of the data has been realized by the government. Adequate funds have been allocated in the economic survey. The budget speech of the finance minister also asked the, adequate budget provision for artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, and all kind of, that kind of advanced technologies. So, after a year, 10 year or 15 year, everything will be digitized. 0, 1, 0, 1. There will be no text. If I am asking how I am working, that how I am working, that will be digitized, because the computer or the artificial intelligence or the anything, ICT, now ICT era has gone. ICT has now gone. Now we are entering in a different era altogether, artificial intelligence era. So everything has to be digitized, and only the digital world will exist after some, digital society will exist after some time. But the problem today is that we don't have that capacity to convert everything in the digits. What has been done? The data analytics and the data scientist, importance, data analytics and data analytics and data scientists are getting more and more importance because of that. Social media data, they are posing, they are giving the good data, but at the same time there are the risk also. Country, safety risk to the country, to the individual. Whether localization of the data is to be done, localization, I don't mean the collection of data at the local level. Localization of data means that the server, for example, that Google, we are using the Google, but the server is somewhere else. It is not in our territory, not in India. Whether that kind of, steps are required. What should be the, the cyber security? What should be the, the different kind of negotiations between the country for security purpose, for data sharing purpose, and all kind of things will be required. So data generation and data digitization, entering into a digital world, it is really taking us. But that requires a lot of capacity building, and we have to raise it today. Thank you.
Thank you, and it sounds like it takes something that was touched on by a lot of the statements, but we didn't get to really dig into, but much more partnership across governments to be able to do that effectively. So it looks like we've come, I do want to just, if there's any really pressing questions, really short, focused questions, I do want to give people the opportunity, although we do need to wrap up. I know I didn't really ask that in a way that anybody felt they could ask a question. So sorry. But I do want to give the panelists just a minute, just very quick, a minute each, if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to make.
I have a closing remark, which we attribute to famous New York Yankee catcher Yogi Berra, that we don't know exactly where we're going, but we're making great time. Thank you.
I would just like to say that when we talk of non-traditional, maybe what was 100 years back, I can say ultra-traditional, is today again becoming non-traditional. So like Sachin gave an example of Uganda and which crops. So the crops which we were growing, say 100 or 200 years back in an organic manner, maybe now we talk that yes, we are non-traditional, that we are going back to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just say last point that the regional cooperation is must for the statistical capacity building of the individual countries. Without that, because we all are the developing world, South Asian countries, Southwest Asia countries, they are basically the developing world. Having the limited resources, either the manpower or the money or the technology, everything is limited with us. And with that, it will not be sufficient to meet the data requirement for SDGs and coping for the I4 and Society 5. So my last suggestion is that we must come to some agreement. Our regional government should come, either BIMSTEC or the ASEAN or ASEAN India or some kind of institution, and they can sit together, a multidisciplinary team including the statisticians, geologists, the mathematician, the computer scientist, computer hardware, everybody should sit and should decide how should we can go and leverage the new technology for our SDG purpose data collection. So partnership is must in the spirit of 17.18 and 17.19 of the SDG.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. I think actually it was a very positive, I think, sort of conclusion from all of this, which is there is a clear argument that we need to keep people sort of really at the center of everything. And if we do that and we think about what is it that really will create security for people in their daily lives, the practice and the institutions and the policies actually will naturally follow. So thank you all very much. I know we extended a little bit over our time, and thank you very much to all of the excellent panelists. I will conclude there.
With this, we end session 4 of the conference. I thank the distinguished panelists for their valuable insights. We will now commence the closing ceremony. I request the distinguished guest for this session to please take the seat on the stage. To commence the closing ceremony, I invite Shri Pradyut Chandra Haldar, President, Policy Perspectives Foundation, to deliver his valedictorian speech.
Chair Mr. Khosri, Mr. Arora, and the distinguished guests. Well, I attended the session from 2 p.m. onwards, and I didn't know it would be that interesting in certain matters. I would have probably tried to cancel my morning appointments and come here. But it was very interesting, these things. I had a written difficulty, but I will comment on some of the points which came up in the last two sessions, because that has a relevance. Because I come from this universe of security. But we have also realized within that universe that there is a need to change the security paradigm that has been traditionally followed. And India was, because certain traditional reasons, because we faced a lot of trouble since the independence in terms of conflict areas and things like that, we had developed something of our own and which have continued till date. And I'm happy to say that that aligns with some of the recommendations that you have. Not that we have succeeded 100% in all those, but we have made a certain good progress. So that example I'll draw from, and I will also be drawing from the experience of my study of what's happening in the West Asia, because that's what spreads everywhere. See, you'll realize that first, as you mentioned, that nature of violence, how it's changing. Nature of violence is becoming more indiscriminate, and at least in one part of India, northeast India, we had sporadic conflict areas and violence because there were separatist movements. We followed both the hard power, because at that point of time, post-independence, the only model that was available was the Malaya model, British campaign in Malaya. And that was based primarily on hard power. But as we prolonged, we also realized, and our political decision makers as well as other supporting structures, that we should start a dialogue with the areas. When the dialogue started, finally, it became a new state of India rather than going away. And the trigger, and that is why I'm bringing that how it aligns. The trigger was a famine there in that part of the country, and the unsatisfactory, according to their perception, response to give relief. Today, I'm happy to say that that state, I think 3 years or 4 years back in the State Assembly, the concerned minister said that the state is now in a position to sell extra food grain because they have made those arrangements. So they have traveled all this journey. The state is also 100% literacy now. So the question is the kind of progress that has been made through this method is that whether at that time probably this goal number 16 didn't exist, but the goal number 16 was felt need of the year, and that was done. We have also been trying that in many other places. In some places, this has resolved the problem. Some of the other places, it has brought down the violence and brought the governance back on, although the original problem has not been resolved. But these are the areas where Government of India very strongly resisted interference by other states. And that is where I come, that when we say that the violence has been changing, post-World War II, there was a Cold War period in which the two nations had their area of influence, but frequent regime changes and other political changes were happening, sometimes with their knowledge, sometimes without their knowledge. Now that geopolitical changes creates an uncertainty, and that we see, I call that grafted structures. They were giving way under pressure of the day, and that is something we saw happening in the West Asia. India is a very diverse country. When the non-traditional security needs were evolving, 1970s, the academics started talking of economic security. Then 1980s, something else happened. Gradually, we came to the economic reform and things like that. But by the time we reached economic reform, globalization was in place. When the globalization takes place, one of the observations that we had was that globalization at one level is very welcome, but also leads to emergence of certain local concerns. The local concerns, I can say broadly in a word, that the fear of submergence. That fear of submergence is something which gives rise to the fault lines. These fault lines must be addressed. And that effort has also been made, because we have gone into creation of Panchayati Raj system. It needs a little bit of tweaking here and there, but that's the right direction. Separation of local heterogeneity normally leads to the problems of conflict, and that is when the violence comes in. In fact, there was one report coming out of, I think it was Africa, Rwanda or something, when neighbors become killers. Because you will have differences coming up through the globalization methods, which creates inequalities in the local community. And then comes the rivalry, which was originally an egalitarian community, becomes riven by inequality. So that is when your conflict state comes. And that is when murders come. So we have had ethnic diversities here. We have had ethnic trouble here. Some clashes which took place on ethnic basis, but fortunately, for last 20 years, we have not had that. Our partition took place on the grounds of religion, and initial period was slightly, the next 1 or 2 years was troublesome, but then we had a long period of peace, which was again broken in, say, 1961 or so. But again, we have a period in which frequent clashes on the grounds of religion is missing. Next point, which I would like to also indicate, that the importance of culture in responding to stresses and responding to inequality is also important, because we have a population of, why only a handful of people from India went to ISIS and why a large number of people went from England and France is a matter of probably alienation. That alienation culturally was probably relatively less here. And that's why we still have, it's not that we do not have trouble, but we are able to cope with the problem. Then another question was mentioned about the role of nations to mitigate the threat. It's very important. If the states, nation states who are supporting the regime, they play a positive role, it can definitely move towards a positive conclusion. We have seen that happening in some of the areas. But it is also a fact of life that there will always be elements who may not be state actors directly, but non-state actors, who would keep this alive. With this happened in West Asia, because it is not a big puzzle that how do they get the arms, the kind of arms they get, how do they get the huge ammunition to continue the trouble. These are being received by them. They were also in receipt of donations from countries who are otherwise friendly to the committee nation which wants improvement in the area. So these areas which must be attended to if you are looking at improving the matters. My own experience in dealing with some of the trouble spots in India has been that if we have patience, if we sit down with them, we are able to bring them down to economic issues or structural issues which irk them. And then those items finally become unacceptable. But this doesn't happen overnight. This doesn't happen if the government shows reluctance to engage them in a dialogue. The government must engage them in a dialogue, and takes time, but ultimately it's the economic things and structural adjustments that might be required without basically compromise the interests of the state, they admit. So I do not see a conflict between the state security if the state security is conscious of preserving and promoting the human security. So that is the balance which we need. Actually, I am now coming back to the discussions here. The discussion that took place earlier in the afternoon on technology. Now, technology is a great enabler, but it is also enabling both sides. It is enabling both the side which wants peace and progress and development. It is also enabling the conflict elements. Social media that sustained many of the movements here, we haven't had any solution to that except a counter kind of a thing that creates more confusion than probably resolve the matter. Uh, on radicalization, we suddenly start talking of counter-radicalization. Actually, you need a counter-narrative, because that counter-narrative should be there, available to a young man who's probably adrift in a night in this ocean of internet, where he goes to the site and finds something. So he should also be able to find something which provides a counter-narrative. And it should be found in the language that he is comfortable with. There, I think that work has begun, but if we jump to the programmatic option of de-radicalization, that's more difficult. We should reach there only after you have done a lot of seeding, or if I can use the word, seeding of the internet with narratives that are positive. But we also have another option. The entire society is vulnerable now, because the new technology makes no distinction. So if it is AI, who's storing the data? If it is Internet of Things, again, who's storing the data? Data localization is a demand which has arisen from the concern that only a few major MNCs are controlling the equipment market of the internet. That has not been resolved. Repeatedly it was said that we are supposed to be a leading nation, we do not produce hardware. It's a deficit. But then, therefore, what we need, I do not want to disrupt this universe, but should you therefore not have some kind of equivalent of Geneva Convention for the use of the internet space, in which no matter who is misusing where, it is the right of the person who has been wronged, or the national entity who has been wronged, to seek the data and seek the legal access. If that is denied, which has been denied in some cases, on the grounds of difference in law, it creates a difference in mind, and then the demands like data localization gets traction and gets legitimacy, and that may impact on the globalization project. So when we are dealing with the, either we make partners, we make rules under which everybody functions and we operate, or we should be ready for disruptive actions, which I think the Chinese have taken. So this is something which is not visible on the horizon. That would be a problem. So I thought I would mention my 2 bits on that count, because India produces a large number of IT workers, but we do not have enough number of cybersecurity professionals. We do not have enough number of, what should I say, the forensic trained people. So obviously, the only way it can be protected is to bring the whole thing here and make the Indian law applicable. Now, if this happens everywhere, it creates a chaotic condition on the internet. But therefore, those who are controlling the internet must realize that this is something that should be done immediately. Otherwise, you are looking at a future which is again going to be fragmented. We also talked of transnational crime. The transnational crime is increasing day by day. It involves our environmental this thing. Some of the protected species are being smuggled out, killed and smuggled out. Their parts are going out. So all this is there. The only solace is that UN published a information booklet in which they showed the routes being taken by the transnational crime. And we have the least amount of points touching us. But that is not a very comfortable area, because we do have one of the major problem of drugs passing through, which is coming from Afghanistan side as well as from the Myanmar side. And this is a great this thing, and I would like a forum like this to discuss that in much greater detail than I think you mentioned about water.
Yes.
That's a very serious problem. We are the water-stressed region, actually. And according to the projection, Hindu Kush and Himalaya glaciers are melting fast and probably will lose 36% of its area in 100 years' time. And that area is a major source of water for the lower riparian states, including India and Bangladesh, as well as China on the other side. So I think it needs to be successfully dealt with. I'm not really aware, because we do have even water disputes currently. So how do we actually resolve the water disputes and then go to the source allocation from the glaciers? That will take time, but this is something which will hit us very soon, with population rising beyond a level, and with water sources becoming, one, scarce, two, polluted to a great extent. So that is another problem. So with that, I think these are the concerns which must come. Thank you. The concerns which must come into the discussions here, and another thing I would like to mention. Such forum should also get civil society to civil society discussions, rather than being the elite discussing amongst them, because finally they have the experience of what is happening on the ground. We have the data about which a number of things have been said. The data may not always be correct at this point of time, but hopefully this will get rectified. So with that, I would like to thank IPAG and RIS for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom and note of optimism. I now request Mr. Syed Munir Khasru, Chairman, IPAC Asia Pacific, to summarize the conference proceeding.
Thank you, and thanks, Mr. Haldar, for giving a very overarching view on the issues that we have spoken about throughout the day. Everyone has long faces for justifiable reason. So just to let you know what we intend to do, whatever we had discussed, we will bring out a sort of set of recommendations and some of the key issues that were discussed. And it will not only go to the participants, we will send it to stakeholders, which includes the Government of India and the UN and others. The whole intention is to get this whole issues activated to the level it should be, because we are, as I was saying, we are into uncharted territories, and the least we can do is to start making sensible scenario planning, what can happen and what kind of response mechanism do we have. Now, what I'm going to do now quickly, the 4 sessions we had, and thanks to our rapporteurs, they've done an excellent job in capturing the essence of the 4 sessions, so which I'll just read out. But if there is something that has been inadvertently left out, no worries, you will get a soft copy. So you can come back to us if you think something you had mentioned may have been left out. and we'll then compile, then it will go out. So we were we were quite precise that this will not be even just people come, speak, leave, and nothing happens. There should be element of continuity. And sir, if it is of any consequence to you, actually this whole initiative has been civil society initiative. Next level, we'll probably move to track 1.5. We'll try to bring in the governments and others. So we are moving step by step. Since many of the topics themselves were quite new, and one of the leading multilateral development agency head wrote me a letter. He wanted to come, but he's not in town now. That he really commended that we are one of the first to have look ahead and start anticipating this risk, which in many parts of the world are not even properly recognized. Now moving on, the first session was on environment and energy, and we had a very good kick start. This session looked into, of course, the growing awareness of environment security, and of course the question came up of data gathering and how much reliable these data are in assessing the actual level of environmental security. And two things that came out very strongly, rightly so, the energy efficiency and energy transition challenges, both in developing and developed countries. Now, some of the major observations and issues that were identified, some of the things we already know, things like not everyone have access to renewable energy sources, and we need to strike a balance between renewable and non-renewable sources, and the sort of need for technology to make transition to more and more to renewable energy sources. Although the cost of renewable energy sources have come down, we also have to look into how much it relates to developing nations making in transition. Now, what are the major challenges? Some of the 4 or 5 challenges that were identified. Number one, rising sea level, particularly countries like Maldives and Bangladesh, which are very vulnerable. Then, of course, migration risk, particularly climate migration, if and when it happens, will make look the forced migration like a tea party, because millions of people will be displaced. And you know, Maldives already have started buying real estate in other countries. Then, of course, the issue of high carbon emission came up. The trade-off of growth between developing economies, because developed countries, which have been one of the major polluters, did so when they grew. Now, at times, we feel it's unfair to put the entire burden on the developing countries. They must have their fair share of rising to the next level. Then, of course, the regulatory barriers that we face. So, key recommendations included quickly: formulating appropriate framework for use of non-renewable resources. Long-term benefits of cost should be factored in considering sustainable development strategies. Then, of course, to provide subsidies in terms of quicker adoption of renewable energy sources. Proactive planning so that efficient technology adoption takes place quicker than slower. Transition across all industry in energy sources, and moving towards centralized production system that can, in a way, cut down the fixed cost. So, as you may note, it reflects a wide and divergent views, which came because panelists had very strong opinion and arguments to support that. So, we thought it was very intellectually stimulating things. Session 2 is in migration. So, it was quite interactive, lively. Key issues: migrant, refugee, asylum seekers, and the need to understand the difference between 3 key terms. Frequently we tend to misunderstand the actual connotation of each terms. Some of the major observations that came out: the displacement crisis, some were of the opinion it may be overstated, while there was also opinion that migrants as a percentage of the global population has declined over the decades. And there is also this argument came out that refugees at times are seen as a threat to the security. Not necessarily was the opinion, because in many cases the direction refugees are heading itself is not necessarily a safe haven. Then also the rights and security of refugees, and there was discussion that many of the UN agencies need to come up to speed, because 1951 convention is outdated, outmoded, given what has happened in the last 5 years in Europe and Asia and so on and so forth. And of course, the cost of migration and first response mechanism varies significantly. We have countries like Germany, we have countries like Bangladesh in receiving end with huge resource endowment differences. So there should be a more coordinated international response mechanism. And also there is the degree of populism and xenophobia which is rippling around the world, which has become a major issue for the migrants, so which needs more political prudence across the continents. Key recommendations quickly: to look at the causes, not just blame the effect, why it's happening, either climate or forced migration. Then, of course, rather than seeing refugees as a threat, to make a connect to the underlying causes which are driving people away from their home, and what can be the sensible way for their safe and dignified return. Then also, immigrants have contributed significantly positively in many economies they have gone. So the panel was of the opinion sometimes it's not a fair projection to always project migrants as a liability to the country and economy they're traveling to. And of course, security and protection of migrants, that is something they are entitled to. And many cases it has been turned other way around, and they have been projected in the light of themselves being a security threat to the country they're moving in, which is not consistent with the reality. Then of course, it's a shared responsibility of all countries. Many countries have stepped up, but other needs to be equally responsible. Rights of refugees, access to education, access to employment, to find a more acceptable global framework so that there's a guideline for both the receiving countries and from where they're fleeing. Okay. Session 3, transnational crime, cyber issues. Well, there was a great deal of talk about technological advancement, AI, fourth industrial revolution, the sort of challenges we are facing in the cyber domain, and the whole this new territory, new technology, invention, access, and what kind of opportunity and risk it poses. And of course, some of the recent things that has happened in the cyber domain, both in the financial sector and non-financial sector, that were discussed threadbare. Need for capacity building, greater awareness, particularly the younger generation, millennials. The recommendation that came in discourse of this include potential cyber threats and need to have a global regulatory framework. We are aware of EU's GDPR. We are aware of some of the things Chinese have done. But the world, by and large, is far behind, technologically improving at much faster rate than regulators are being able to cope up with. Then, of course, cyber education, which I already alluded to. Localization of data and also support investment in hardware components. And also to emphasize on the integrity of the financial system and to build a robust financial architecture, since transaction happens across nations, countries, continents, defy borders, so all are in the same game. So nobody is excluded, included, and the framework should have that element of inclusivity. And of course, to understand better the technological motivations that at times, for right or wrong reasons, mostly of course wrong reasons, motivate the hackers, cyber criminals, so on and so forth. The last session was on human and economic security. It dealt on sustainable development goals, and of course there's a clear recognition that between what needs to be done, what has been, there's a huge gap, a yawning gap of almost $2.5 trillion at a time when global development fund is shrinking. So the challenge is how do we bridge the gap, and in absence of that, and some things like even in OECD 50 fragile states, 46% people live in extreme poverty, and if these SDG goals are missed, that 46% will jump to 62%. So we are looking at a future with a lot of excitement with AI and robotics and 3D printing. At the same time, extreme poverty is on the rise, which will automatically, inevitably, fundamentally question the security landscape. So what also came out, that to have a better secure future, access to quality health and education is a must. And of course, SDG by 2030 is an ambitious target. And all those, and South Asia as a region, although continues to be one of the fastest growing region in the world, this is a region which houses 1/3 of global poor. This is a region where 200 million people have income of less than $2 per day. So those are also some stark economic realities if gone unchecked, unaddressed for a long time, can be another potential source of social instability and the resulting risks. That more or less captures some of the key things we talked about throughout the day. But as I said, it will go to our distinguished participants and others so that you can have a chance to, and we want to carry it forward. So we look forward to this continued interaction and engagement. And I must thank both the participants from within India and those who traveled so much to join us to make this event a success. I know many of you had a lot of challenging times starting from visas and tickets and all that, but we do appreciate your tenacity. And again, thanks to RIS, our partner, who have been a great support. So, of course, most of you will be seeing each other again, and you are invited to a reception today evening. So I think that more or less closes. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Sorry.
I invite Mr. Mahesh Arora, Director, Finance and Administration, RIS, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. It's my proud privilege to be here before you to convey our gratitude to our partners. I would first of like to convey our gratitude to Shri Haldar, who is present here with us. He is the president of the Policy Perspectives Foundation in Delhi, for his gracious presence to deliver the valedictory address on this special occasion, which I consider highly educative, timely, and experience and reality-based. Similarly, I convey our thanks, of course, to Professor S.D. Muni, who this morning conveyed our keynote address here. I also convey our profound thanks to Professor Khusru from IPAG and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi from RIS for their joint leadership to bring this event into reality at a rather short notice. I would say the notice was so short, it all came through a call only, and it worked perfectly.
True.
I consider this event to be setting in motion the great idea of thinking on vital issues in a non-conventional way or non-traditional way. To begin with, RIS on its own, non-traditional way, has ventured into economic issues with their security dimension today with this meeting. This is the first ever thing that we have done in the non-traditional way. The launch of the book this morning was really a bonus for all of us. It, I think, was a wonderful compendium that gives you unvarnished knowledge on security issues in several fields from special experts. It is not only useful for the academics and policy shapers, but also for the student community also. The presence of such a wide range of security and economic experts on this occasion, bringing on the table knowledge, experience, and expertise itself is a commendable task, for which I thank you very much, Dr. Khusru. Their connect with the contemporary issues is far more important than getting into the theoretical frameworks. That is, I think, that matters a lot. That is vividly clear from what we have heard from Mr. Haldar here. I would also like to thank the moderators and the panelists of the key sessions, as well as the audience, for their interesting and at times probing and loaded questions also. That made the really proceedings very livelier at times. I would especially acknowledge with gratitude the presence of our foreign guests who have made it possible to be with us after such a long travel, sparing their time despite their hectic schedules. Thank you so much once again to all of you. I would also like to sincerely thank Professor Khusru and his on-site colleagues, Mr. Abdullah Ar-Rafi, Mr. Mohiddin Kokon, and their off-site colleagues who have actually made this possible with a high sense of professionalism. I would also like to thank the volunteers who have brilliantly helped us, and I find for the gender balancing, many of them women are also present here. That's really extraordinary, very impressive. I really applaud their presence. I would like to thank RI's on-site team and off-site team, especially Shalini and Anil, who are present here, for their help in making logistical arrangements. I also thank our senior faculty members who are also present here now, many of them, who have substantively contributed to the outcome of this major event in a very impressive manner. I thank you all for making it possible. Thank you once again.
This brings us to the end of the international conference. On behalf of RIS and IPAC Asia Pacific, I thank you all for staying with us till the very end of today's event, and we look forward to meeting you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. नई बिल्डिंग में ग्राउंड फ्लोर में 7:38 come चला please